Okay, this is just going to be a really brief introduction to the Scorpion Engine 2023.3. I haven't done one of these videos in quite a while, so I thought it was well overdue for a new introduction. So you can download the Scorpion Engine here on GitHub. I'll drop this link into the chat. It's just this button here on the page. The engine and the editor itself are not open source, but all of the game projects, the example games and demos are all open source, so you can remix them however you wish. Just make sure to check the individual licenses for the individual demos, because a lot of the content is Creative Commons, and so sometimes they have restrictions like you have to acknowledge the original developer, or you can't use it in commercial productions, those sorts of things. Right, so I'm just going to open one of the sample games. So this is the Amiga the Fox project, so it's a clone of Super Mario Brothers. We're running it in Amiga mode right now. I will switch between Amiga and Mega Drive mode for places where it is different, but for the most part, the two platforms are almost identical. So when we open it up, we get the palette at the middle of the screen, and we can edit each of these colors straight from here. On the Amiga mode, we can choose from how many bit planes we want. 4-bit planes is usually what I recommend for Amiga, because you have 16 colors for your for most of your content, and then another 16 colors for your sprites, and the performance of that is very good. If you go up to 32 colors, then your performance dips down, and you might want to consider making your game only for AGA, or only for if it's running at 25 frames a second. But for most Scorpion games, if you're running it at 16 colors, it will run 50 frames on an Amiga 500, no problem. All right. So down the side here, we have just our buttons for opening and closing projects. We can change the scale of the project by dragging this, or scale of the user interface. So if you wanted to fit more things on screen, you can do that there. You've got settings for emulation, and down the bottom we have buttons for export. So we can export to an ADF floppy image. We can run it in emulators. Down here we have our commands, so we can assign events to keyboard or CD32 pad. And down here is more advanced settings for these ones, are for the most part specifically for Amiga. At the bottom we can set the talk pad. So the talk pad is a panel where we display text that we might want to show the player, like NPC dialogue, and then the startup code block. I'll go into what code blocks are later, but the startup code block is just the code that we're using to initialize the game. So I'm just going to briefly switch over to the Mega Drive / Genesis view. So it's very similar. There's not as many options for things like bit planes, because those options wouldn't make sense on the Mega Drive. You can set the width of the Mega Drive display, similar to what you can do on the Amiga. With the palette settings, so you can choose different, basically how many palettes, or how many palette lines that you to use for your main game. So this one we're using 2 palette lines, because everything in the game is either this set of colors or that set of colors. Typically, you might want to set it to the 4 palette lines for 64 colors if you've got game objects that use all 4 of those palette lines. But the reason why I've only got it set to 2 is because since most things in the game only use those colors, then it reduces the time it needs to do fade operations, for example, because it only needs to fade 32 colors rather than 64. Um, the commands work the same on Amiga, except there's no support for the Mega Drive keyboard. So commands you can only assign to buttons on the gamepad. So, for example, here I've just got a cheat to skip to the next level, and that cheat is just pushing the start button on the pad. Oh, and the other thing, of course, is the export options are different. So we can open it with a number of different emulators. You do need to have these emulators downloaded and installed. We can set the region. So if we've got United States set, it will run at 60 frames in Blastem. Otherwise, if we have Europe set, it will be 50 frames in Blastem. We also have a export to the Dragon Drive, which is a cartridge made by Dragonbox.de for self-publishing. Okay, I'm going to move into the animation tab. So with the animations, we need to assemble them out of individual frames. So we create a new animation by clicking this, and then we need to save it into a folder that has animation frames. So I'm going to save this one in here. I'm going to call this new fish. And then I can just add those 2 frames in there. I can enter play. The options here are almost completely the same between Amiga and Mega Drive. But with Mega Drive, we have, for example, we've got the palette line setting, so we can choose to set it to this set of colors or that set of colors. And we can set whether it's high priority, so whether it's in the foreground above everything else. If I switch over to the Amiga mode, the options are a little bit different in that we've got more options for using hardware sprites, or because we can store Amiga graphics and memory a whole bunch of ways, we've got some more options here. So, for example, with the sliced mode, it will save a lot of memory, but performance will be degraded a little bit for it. So that you might want to consider that option for Amiga 500 games, where every byte of chip RAM is you want to save. Okay, so I'll go over to the Actors tab. This is completely the same between Amiga and Mega Drive. There's no differences here. What we can do is create a new actor from here. And then once we've done that, we can assign animations to all of the directions. We can assign things for sound for attack. Down this side, we've got what happens when we collide with walls. So, for example, this one here, this one doesn't have any collision, but we can say, well, it bounces off tiles, or it stops when it runs into a tile, or we could even have it destroyed if we run into a solid tile. So for projectiles, we would use that. And then down here, we have various events. So, for example, here we have it every 250 frames we make fish jump, so that's a custom code block. And we also say, well, when the player collides with this, then we run this code, player hits monster. From here we can change the type of movement. So this one is CPU platform, so this one is controlled by Scorpion engine itself, and we've set its platform because we want gravity applied to it. If we wanted that fish to be controllable, we could choose from down here any of these controllable movement types. Alright, I'm just going to go into audio and NM5. So this tab is quite different between Amiga and Mega Drive, and I'm just going to briefly go over the Amiga side first. So there are three types of files we support. We support just regular sound files, so this can be in the 8 SVX format, which is the Amiga native format, but we also now support WAV, OGG, and MP3. For WAV files and MP3 files, we can specify whether it's CD music. So if we have a song that's in MP3 format, we can specify that it's CD music, and so that will only get included with a CD32 build. But we do support ProTracker music as well in mod format, and we also do support the NM5 animation format, though we don't have any NM5s in this particular format, in this particular project. So I'm just going to switch back over to Mega Drive so I can discuss what's different about Mega Drive side. So with Mega Drive side, we use the MDS DRV sound driver, which uses MML. So we don't have support for ProTracker as a separate column yet, and we don't have support for Anim5 animations yet. Those may possibly come in future, but for now, all of your sound effects and all of your music has to be in MML format. What we can do is for sound effects, if you drop some WAV files in the project, you can click this button and it will generate an MML file for every sound effect. And we can edit these MML files here. So, for example, for the power up MML, you can open that, and then this file is basically an auto-generated wrapper for this one WAV file. So because this is set up, we can trigger this power up sound within the game itself. Okay, so what blocks are? They are tiles that are dynamic. So with maps made in Scorpion, the tiles are usually static. You can't change them. They just sit there in the level. But with blocks, you can change them at real time, and every square in the entire map can be set to a different block. And all of these do have all of these you can assign events to. So, for example, with this we've got some custom handling for if a player collides with this block. We have some handling for if a turtle shell hits the block, so we can actually make an enemy interact with that block, an enemy projectile. We do have this ability for assigning an event to an animation frame. So that's every few refresh frames we can say for example, we want to run some logic on that block, or we want to change that to a different block. So, for example, in a Bomberman type game, you could have a block that's the player's bomb, and then you could use that to cycle through the animation frames before it explodes. From here, we can also set what the collision property of the block is. So, for example, we've said this one is solid, but we can have we can make it a platform, so we can jump with the platform. We can jump on top of it, but we can also jump onto it from underneath, so it only blocks movement when it's going downwards. And also, we have the slope option. There's some demos for that, but that's for making games like Sonic the Hedgehog, where there are nice smooth slopes through the level. There are some differences between Amiga and Mega Drive versions. So, for example, for each of the four corners on the Mega Drive, we can set a different palette line, and we can set whether it's high priority or not. So if we want the block to appear in front of the sprites, we can tick these boxes here. Just going to switch back over to Amiga mode. And then on Amiga mode, we've got the ability to set fast split. So that's a faster way of splitting the block that doesn't use the mask. So that will basically wipe out anything on the background that's underneath it. Okay, so code blocks are what drive our logic. It's a way of scripting logic without needing to know code. What we do is when we want to create a new block of logic, we click the create button here, and then when we've done that, we can say, well, what variables and what constants do we want? So all of the variables and all of the constants are global, so everything we declare here we can access elsewhere in the game. And then underneath we have some, well, we can line by line we can determine what our logic is, so it flows top to bottom, and we can use conditionals to branch. We can also use the goto command to go to a different code block, for example. This is our startup one, and so, for example, at the very top, we're checking, are we running this on an Amiga? And if we're running it on an Amiga, our setup is a little bit different to Mega Drive, so we're doing these things. But if that's false, if we're not running it on an Amiga, if we're running it on a Mega Drive, then the setup for the music volume is a little bit different. And again, with this, there's not really any difference between the Amiga and Mega Drive view, other than some of these functions work differently. Like some of them will not function on Amiga, some of them will not function on Mega Drive. They will just do nothing if you happen to run it on the platform it isn't designed for. To add a new line, we just click here, and then from here we can say, well, what category of thing do we want to do? So I'm going to select display, and then we can select type, and for example, I can go camera position, and I'll say, okay, we'll move the camera to 100 by 100, for example. Okay, so the fonts tab, we just use that for creating bitmap fonts. So there are two fonts included by default, one for the numbers and then one for numbers and letters. We can use this import button to import a TTF file, and it will try to create a bitmap font from any TrueType file. But usually the results aren't very clean, so you may need to do a lot of manual tidying up on an imported font. Otherwise, you could simply, if you click this, you can actually edit this image in your graphics editor and replace it with anything you want. So the Maps tab. So maps are where we create our game levels. So before we actually create a level, we need to create a tile set. And so this is an example of a tile set. This is Beastlands by Cert on OpenGameArt. So if we've got a tile set like this, we just click the plus button, and then we just select the PNG that contains our tile set. And once we've done that, we can then create a level. And again, we just click here, begin with. The very first thing it asks for is the default tile set, so we need to have created a tile set first. When we've created the level, we can then edit it in Tiled. So you need to download Tiled separately. It's this brilliant map editor, and then from here you can add your actors and your tiles and your blocks straight to the map. So, for example, the ground comes from the Beastlands tile set. That's my starting actor there, and these are some blocks that I can interact with. And then panels. So panels we use for things like static display, but in some cases we use it for things like parallax background. So, for example, all versions of the game have this title screen, and that's configured as what we call the main middle panel. So we want this to cover the whole screen. If we had a smaller panel, we could say that it's the bottom panel or top panel. So for things like UI, uh, elements, we can assign so elements for things like lives and scores, so variables that you want to see on the screen. We can also assign options. So for games that have a menu screen, we can assign our options here. I'm just going to briefly go over. So this is the panel created to handle the parallax on Mega Drive, and we can see we've actually put our lives and our coins on the panel here, so that saves us from needing to use sprites to represent our UI. And from here we have our slices set. So we say, well, this top bit, it doesn't scroll at all, but if we go down this from here, it scrolls a little bit, and then from there it scrolls much faster. And that's it for this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments below, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. And do consider supporting the Scorpion Engine Patreon. The project relies on support from the generous backers. And thanks very much for watching, and I'm really looking forward to the games that you create in the Scorpion Engine.